And everyone, and no one is paying attention. Imagine that. No one is paying attention to the bills they pass in Washington. And it passes. And then everybody looks around and says, what have we done? And there's a compromise move where they're going to increase the funding to $20 million. Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who had once owned a distillery before Prohibition, says we wouldn't know what to do with this money if we had $20 million. And we're not going to accept the money into the enforcement efforts. And it goes down to something like $2 million per year for enforcement of Prohibition. The government under Harding, Coolidge, and up to Hoover puts more emphasis on enforcement than his two predecessors. But one student of Prohibition says, this was a game that Congress was playing. You would make anti-booze statements, you would make pro-prohibition statements to the voters, but you would never put the money in for enforcement because that would tick off the wets and they would actually run someone against you. So you were playing this game right down the middle. There was, far more effective than this, were the accountants who got Capone for tax evasion. They had come up with 5,000 counts of Prohibition law violation against Capone, and they never brought them to court. They said, oh, this won't work for whatever reason. And they put the tax cheating case before the court, and they sent him to jail. Now, compare the penalties which Capone got for tax evasion to that $500 or 6-month fine for violating the Volstead Act prohibition, 11 years. They sent him away for 11 years. So
to Alcatraz,
to Atlanta, and then finally to Alcatraz. They let him out because, as what I said earlier about getting liquored up and coming back with something, he had syphilis. His mind was gone by that point. He was quite the wreck before he died. Now, the two most effective prohibition agents were very much unlike Eliot Ness. Eliot Ness is 26 years old. He's a college graduate. He's not a WASP, but he's a Norwegian, close enough. And he's from the Midwest. The two most effective guys are two Jews immigrants from New York City, a guy named Izzy Einstein, a guy who's about 5'5" and 200 pounds or something, big roly-poly guy, and his pal named Mo Smith. And Einstein shows up at the beginning of Prohibition and says, I want to be a Prohibition agent. They said, what's your background? I work in the post office. Okay, you don't look like a Prohibition agent. Well, that's why I would be a good Prohibition agent, because I wouldn't look like a Prohibition agent to anyone else. So these two guys go out, and Mo Smith had worked at a cigar stand. They are masters of disguises. Einstein knew 6 different languages, so he could mix with anyone. He could pose as a fruit vendor or a pickle vendor. Once he posed they posed as delegates to the 1924 Democratic Convention. And they would go in to a saloon. Sometimes there would be a picture of Smith hanging on the wall, and he would still be able to make the arrest. So in his time, he made nearly 5,000 arrests, seized 4 million gallons of alcohol, and had a conviction rate of 95%. It was very difficult for anyone else to get any sort of conviction in New York.
So Hoover is elected in 28, it takes office in 29, and in October, of course, the stock market crash happens.
Yes.
And that changes the economic reality for millions of Americans.
Right.
For almost everyone in America is affected in some way. That starts to really change the dialogue now as the federal government, as revenues drop and all these things. The government is now starting to look for new revenue streams. And of course, the idea of taxing that with alcohol is a big part of it. And so in the 1932 campaign with Franklin Roosevelt, he is a wet candidate. So explain what's going on in the country at that point, what a wet candidate means, and why it was important to his campaign.
The for a long time, the dries were doing well politically. The 1924 and 1928 Democratic platforms come out for strict enforcement and hammer the Republicans for not enforcing Prohibition better. Franklin Roosevelt, as an upstate Democrat in the New York State Senate, where he starts his career, has to tread kind of carefully on this issue, and he always does. He's not a teetotaler. He's not drunk, but he's not a teetotaler. He'll lift the glass occasionally. Oh, and also in that 1 year grace period of stocking up, he stocks up. Okay, so he's in the state legislature. He's for local option, meaning I'm not going to make this a state issue. But if this town out there in Columbia County wants to, ban booze, fine, we'll do that. He receives a rating of 100% for his voting record from the Anti-Saloon League, okay? But he's not really a dry. In 1920, he supports William McAdoo, who is a Prohibition candidate for the nomination for most of that convention, and then he's a big backer of Al Smith. But he's never in a really wet candidate until 1930 and that election, when the wheels have fallen off the Prohibition movement. And the Republicans, as so often the case, hand him a present in terms of their strategy. They have nominated a prosecutor from the U.S. Southern District who had been a big Prohibition buster, but he's flipped on the issue. So no one quite trusts him. And at this point, Roosevelt finds it opportune to finally announce that he is finally for repeal. But he's still treading carefully. When the state convention wants to make this part of their platform, he says, no, don't do that. And when he's running for president in 1932, he is the driest of the major candidates. Al Smith is very wet. There's a governor of Maryland who is sopping wet. I mean, Governor Ritchie. He's a very conservative guy and very, very much for Prohibition repeal. Roosevelt is backed largely by the dries. And another thing where his enemies fall into a trap, which he's going to play very, very well, is the Smith people, the Al Smith people, the really wet people in the Democratic Party, call for a meeting which is going to call for full repeal. The whole party is going to flip, and this is before the convention. And this really upsets the dries in the Democratic Party from the South, like Cordell Hull, who's going to be Roosevelt's Secretary of State. And Roosevelt sides with the dries as late as early or as 1931. It is only until the convention when he shows up and really is beaming and saying how much he is going to be for Prohibition that he's going to be really identified with that. Hoover, meanwhile, has botched the whole thing sky high. The 1928 election was in some ways a referendum on Prohibition. And Al Smith, who is wet, gets whomped horribly. But then Hoover, who can't mind his own business, appoints a commission which says there's this problem with Prohibition, there's that problem, there's all the problems you've always heard about. And it's terrible, and let's keep it. And this pleases no one, as does Hoover's pronouncement during the 1928 campaign, which is, he doesn't say it like this, but he says an experiment of noble intent or something, which is translated into noble experiment. And no one likes this phrase. Why don't they like this phrase? They don't like it because the wets say, this isn't noble, this is stupid. And the dries say, it's not an experiment, it's here to stay. So he's ticked off both sides. There's also, in the 1932 election, there's a candidate in North Carolina who says to his voters, he says, up there in New York, Herbert Hoover was just up there, and he dedicated the bridge. I think he talked about the George Washington Bridge. And he says that bridge is like Hoover. It's wet on the bottom, dry on the top, and it goes both ways. But also in that same year, in the California primary, FDR was running against John Nance Gardner and Al Smith. And a leaflet is given out. And it says, if you are wet, vote for Smith. If you are dry, vote for Gardner. If you don't know where you stand, vote for Roosevelt. So the politicians are, shall we say, politicians. One of the great lessons, I think, of Prohibition is how public opinion can turn on a dime. Okay? It comes in a rush in the late teens, and it vanishes in a rush in that period. I won't say from 1928, because it's still riding high in 28 and 29, but from 1930 to 1933, it's gone.
Well, FDR becomes president on March 4th,
right?
And on March 20th, he passes the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, which is not the 20th Amendment. It doesn't repeal prohibition, but it allows for the sale of beer and wine so that the government can collect the tax revenues, because they needed that money to fund all of his New Deal projects. So it was the second major piece of legislation passed in the first 100 days.
And as a revenue issue, there's an anti-prohibition group which forms immediately when it comes in. And it doesn't do much of anything until 1926. In 1926, somebody who was supporting prohibition flips. And his name is Pierre S. DuPont, as a DuPont. And he brings all his relatives with him, and the majority of the board of directors of General Motors, including John Jacob Raskob, who is going to be Al Smith's Democrat national chairman. And all these guys ramp up the American Association for Repeal of the Prohibition Amendment, against the Prohibition Amendment. And they put more and more money in. And if you take a look at some of their internal correspondence, what are they motivated by? Well, they want to get a drink, obviously. They may be saying the prohibition law is creating scofflaws and corruption and all that sort of thing. But they're concerned about their tax rates. Even in the Coolidge, Mellon, Harding low tax rates, these guys want lower tax rates. And so the idea that you can lower the taxes or raise government revenue is a very powerful one in Prohibition. It's more powerful when the Depression hits and they think, well, they can use this money to fund programs, et cetera, et cetera. But these guys are going to show up again. These are the same bunch of guys who, when Franklin Roosevelt is president of the United States, they will form the American Liberty League, which is the conservative group which is opposing the New Deal. So you see history going around in circles quite often.
All right, we're going to get to questions from you in just a minute, and there will be a book signing afterwards, but I have the last question for you, which is that there's quite an interesting and tragic story about a man who switched from being a lawyer to being a bootlegger.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of tragic, but it's also fascinating how corrupting this whole prohibition process was.
The most interesting bootlegger is not Capone. I mean, you know, he's violent and all that, and he has some good quotes and has a soup kitchen for the poor when he's actually on trial as a PR move. But also from Chicago is a fellow named George Remus. Remus was an immigrant, but from Germany, came over when he was a couple of years old, and was an orphan boy. His parents died, and he was apprenticed out to an uncle in Chicago who was a pharmacist. So he learned to be a pharmacist, got bored with that, became an attorney. And he was not a bad attorney, fairly successful. He was experimenting with an early insanity defense. Didn't always work, but he was working on that. But then Prohibition comes in, and he finds himself defending the bootleggers. and they're peeling off $1,000 bills to pay fines for, themselves and their cohorts. And he's thinking, I'm on the wrong end of this business, okay? I should be in this business. And did we mention, I don't think we mentioned, medicinal alcohol. The old W.C. Fields movies where W.C. Fields would say, ah yes, for medicinal purposes only. Well, the idea was that you'd take a snort to get you over some malady or other. And they actually wrote this into the Volstead Act, where a physician over maybe a 3-month period could write 100 prescriptions for medicinal alcohol, and then you'd go to a pharmacy and you'd get a pint of hooch to get you over this. Now, you'd go to the doctor and you'd say, doctor, it hurts here. And you'd say, well, maybe it would hurt less if I did this. But if you didn't get that prescription, you'd probably go somewhere else. And you'd take all the rest of your business with you. And so the doctors were very loath to not write those prescriptions, and they were getting $3 a pop to get those prescriptions, so it became very lucrative. In 1917, the American Medical Association went on record and said, there is no value whatsoever to booze as a medicine. By 1922, they're not only backtracking on that, they say, take that 100 prescription level restriction off. So Remus is looking at this, and he says, I know how to get these prescriptions done. I can get forged prescriptions done or forged certificates done, and there's all this booze, the hard stuff, in distilleries kept in warehouses under guard in Kentucky. I'm going to move to Cincinnati to be near all this booze, and I'm going to get all that booze out. And he has convoys of alcohol, which are coming out of these distilleries to fill prescriptions. And then, oddly enough, they're hijacked. Who could have done that? Who would have known the route these trucks were taking? Well, of course, it was a big cooked-up job. He's making a huge fortune. He is actually sort of like the Great Gatsby. You'd come to his house for a party, and all the women would come back with a diamond watch under their plate. Or you'd go outside, and there'd be a car waiting for you, and it would be your car, new, courtesy of George Remus. So he's doing well, and he has the assurance from Jess Smith, who is a crony of the Attorney General of the United States, that nothing will happen to him and he'll never go to jail. But Smith realizes that the authorities are onto him, and in the suite he shares in Washington with the Attorney General of the United States, Harry Daugherty, one day he puts a gun to his head and blows his brains out. The protection is gone for George Remus, and he goes to Atlanta Penitentiary. While he's there, the agent who put him there takes up with his wife. And they proceed to strip him of all his assets. When Remus gets out of jail, he finds absolutely no furniture in his house. He's ticked and sues for divorce, or she sues for the divorce. Everyone sues for divorce. And on the way to the courthouse, he sees his wife in a car and instructs his driver, pull her over. And he does, gets out of the car, and shoots his wife dead. He defends himself at the trial. And remember that insanity defense? My client here, who shot his wife, was temporarily insane. And you'd be too. And the jury says, yeah, we would. And instead of sending him to the chair, they send him to an insane asylum. Where from the insane asylum, he now argues, my client is now sane. And he gets out. But he's basically a ruined man. But that's the story of George Remus, one of the more unknown, but more successful, up to a point, bootleggers in America. Thank you.
On that note, can we round of applause? And I think we have a microphone, and we're trying to here. Cliff will bring around, so if you have a question, raise your hand. And somebody's going to have to have a question from that fantastic presentation. Here we go. It's coming.
Do you have any sense about gangsters? Were they in favor of prohibition so that they could make money because booze was then going to be sold illegally?
Logically, they should have been in favor of it. They should have been like sending campaign contributions to Congress to keep it in. But they seem to be, you know, opposed to it as much as anyone else. And they were putting their money into different things. So, like, I think Capone was putting his money into laundries. And they were putting, you know, getting into other businesses. And the numbers racket, say, in Harlem, Dutch Schultz, people like that. But no, you would think that they would be a big lobbying group just from their own self-interest, but I never pick up on that. Yes? Who's next?
And what over here? No?
That fellow.
The 21st Amendment was the only one not ratified by the state legislatures.
Right.
How were the people who voted to repeal chosen? Were they chosen by state officials, or why did they pass the buck on even allowing the people to vote instead of the state legislatures?
The people who were in the anti-prohibition and the repeal movement really distrusted the state legislatures and didn't think they would have the votes. Remember the stat I gave about in the 21 states, nobody voted, you know, against prohibition. So they were still wary of that, and with 1/3 of the states being able to block it, they didn't want to take any chances. Another reason they did that was one of the stratagems of the repeal movement, of the DuPont-backed repeal movement, was to have these big referendums in the states. And except in California was pretty strong, dry territory. There were a couple referendums which supported the dry cause in California even fairly late. But in the other states, they would hold these referenda to, shall we say, gin up support for repeal. In one of them was like Montana. There's always the question of, you know, we're Catholics for prohibition or against. They had a Catholic senator named Walsh who became Roosevelt's first Attorney General, right? Now there's an interesting story. Let's digress. Not long. Walsh was a Catholic. He was a dry. But then after this referendum in Montana, he switched to being a wet. But the really interesting thing about Walsh is he's named by Roosevelt to be Attorney General. And he's an older fellow. He's a distinguished statesman. And he goes down to Cuba and he marries this